Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome again to the International Spring School in International Politics and Security organized by the University of Padua. I'm very pleased to welcome today a very prominent guest, Professor Bruce Hoffman, who is going to give a keynote speech about the war on terror 20 years on. So I'm going briefly to introduce Professor Hoffman, who has been studying terrorism and insurgency for almost half a century. He's currently professor at the Georgetown University Walsh School of Foreign Service, where he also directs the Center for Jewish Civilization. Hoffman was previously the director of the Center for Security Studies and the Security Studies program. He was also appointed a commissioner on the 9/11 Review Commission by the US Congress and has been scholar in residence for counterterrorism at the Central Intelligence Agency. Hoffman is also recipient of the United States Intelligence Community SEALs Medallion, so the highest level of commendation given to a non-government employee. And he's also, as probably you all know, the author of an award-winning book, Anonymous Soldiers, and among his most recent books and publication, we can list The Evolution of Global Terrorist Threat in 2014, and the very well-known Inside Terrorism, which really constituted an important point of reference for all scholars and students who study terrorism and insurgency. Last but not least, Professor Hoffman was recently named as one of the 250 most influential people who will be playing the biggest role in federal Washington policies debates of the next few years. So I'm very, very pleased to welcome you, Professor Hoffman. I leave immediately the floor with your speech, the War on Terror 20 Years On. Thank you again for accepting our invitation.
Thank you very much, Professor Lomalini, for that extremely kind and generous introduction. What I'd like to talk to you about is actually cover a lot of ground is describe where we are in the war on terrorism and how we got there. The premise of this lecture is that we're at a crossroads or a cul-de-sac. I'm not sure which one, but clearly I would argue a new direction is necessary for the reasons that I will explain. So thank you very much for your attention and indeed for this kind invitation to present a keynote address to the IPSC Summer School. The war on terror has become the longest ongoing armed conflict in the history of the United States. It has lasted longer than America's participation in both world wars and surpassed even the period that the United States military was actively engaged in combat operations during the Vietnam War. It has cost the United States over $5 trillion and claimed the lives of more than 7,000 American military personnel. Yet, as the war on terror enters its third decade, any kind of meaningful victory seems more distant than ever. 20 years of fighting have indeed produced only mixed results. Bin Laden and al-Baghdadi are of course dead, but the movements they each founded and led remain active. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, Ramzi bin al-Shaib, and other senior al-Qaeda operatives responsible for the 9/11 attacks are imprisoned, but none have stood trial, much less been convicted of their crimes. Tens of thousands of terrorists have indeed been killed, but hundreds of thousands of civilians have also lost their lives, both from terrorism and as collateral casualties in military operations. And despite it all, there are now at least 4 times as many Salafi jihadi terrorist organizations active throughout the world as there were on September 11th, 2001. Bin Laden, therefore, would likely be pleased if he were alive today. The war he proclaimed a quarter of a century ago continues. Al-Qaeda has survived arguably the greatest onslaught in history directed against the terrorist group. A new generation of recruits currently fights in a conflict that began before many of them were born. On the eve of the 9/11 attacks, bin Laden predicted that his martyrdom when it came, and I'm quoting, will create more Osama bin Ladens. He was correct. As the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks approaches, it is perhaps opportune to take stock of where this epochal struggle, first proclaimed 3 presidential administrations ago, now stands, revisit anew why the war on terror has persisted and eluded decisive closure, and consider how it has affected the country that initiated, championed, and has led it. So first, let me focus on where did we go wrong? Why are we still enmeshed in this war on terror 2 decades later? On September 20th, 2001, President George W. Bush addressed a special joint session of Congress and the American people. My fellow citizens, he declared, for the last 9 days, the entire world has seen for itself the state of the Union, and it is strong. All of America, he continued, was touched on the evening of the tragedy to see Republicans and Democrats join together on the steps of this Capitol singing the song, God Bless America. Our war on terror, President Bush went on, begins with Al-Qaeda, but it does not end there. It will not end, President Bush declared, until every terrorist group of global reach has been found, stopped, and defeated. The notion of the elected representative of both of the country's 2 main political parties standing together and singing in unison now seems a quaint reminder of a distant, seemingly lost past. Given the rancor, divisiveness, and polarization permeating the United States today, it is almost inconceivable to imagine a time such as the aftermath of 9/11, when both parties, both legislative chambers, the White House, as well as the American people themselves, were all united by a common purpose and resolutely committed to so vast an undertaking. Bush had cautioned that this would be unlike any war the United States had ever fought. There would be no swift conclusion, he warned, as there had been a decade earlier with the first Gulf War against Iraq. Nor would it resemble the exclusive reliance on air power in lieu of ground troops that the United States had experienced in Kosovo just a few years later. Americans, President Bush stated, should not expect one battle, but a lengthy campaign unlike any we have ever seen. Even so, no one then would likely ever have believed that the United States and its allies would still be engaged in the same war 2 decades later. The war on terror was to be different in one other key respect. It was to be a war of ideas as well as kinetics. Although Bush did not use that specific phrase in his address on September 20th, 2001, the concept of bringing freedom and democracy to peoples hitherto deprived of these values as a means to counter extremism was palpable from the start. Americans are asking, the president famously inquired, why do they hate us? They hate what they see right here in this chamber, he went on, a democratically elected government. Their leaders are self-appointed. They hate our freedoms, our freedom of religion, our freedom of speech, our freedom to vote and assemble and to disagree with one another, the president said. The heady early successes achieved in Afghanistan by small numbers of U.S. Army Special Forces soldiers and CIA Special Activities Division operatives in support of the Northern Alliance would eventually be superseded by a markedly more conventional approach. The speed and ease with which the Taliban was defeated and al-Qaeda's presence in Afghanistan was obliterated had solidified Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld's conviction that the US military's unrivaled technological mastery was unstoppable against all foes, whether conventional or irregular. The failure to kill or capture bin Laden and a large contingent of his fighters at Tora Bora in December 2001, coupled with the Pyrrhic US victory that the following March during Operation Anaconda in the Sha'ikot Valley, should have raised concerns about the challenges in fighting elusive, lightly armed, irregular adversaries by relying on air power and deliberately modest-sized ground forces. Reflecting on his own experiences during the Second Anglo-Afghan War, Colonel C.E. Caldwell explained how the Taliban's 19th century Pashtun predecessors had effectively countered and ultimately negated the superior technology and firepower of their Western conventional military opponents. This was precisely the point made in 2007 by US Army Specialist Salvatore Giunta, the first living recipient of the US Medal of Honor since the Vietnam War. After an especially bloody engagement in Afghanistan's Korangal River Valley, Giunta said the richest, most trained army got beat by dudes in manjamis and AKs, as in AK-47s, the Soviet originated assault weapon. By then, the Taliban had already been fighting both that country's democratically elected government and its US and coalition allies for 5 long years. It had, in fact, taken the Taliban only months to regroup and recover from the American-led invasion. More problematical was that the US was now totally preoccupied with the impending invasion of Iraq. It did not have to be this way. Richard A. Clarke, the National Coordinator for Security, Infrastructure Protection, and Counterterrorism under both Presidents Clinton and Bush, wrote in his award-winning book, Against All Enemies, his 2004 account of the events leading up to the September 11th attacks and the US response. We did not have to go after Iraq after September 11th, Clarke wrote. Smoke was still pouring out of the Pentagon the following day, he recalled, when Rumsfeld fastened his attention squarely, quote unquote, on getting Iraq. To Clarke's mind, having been attacked by Al-Qaeda, for us now to go bombing Iraq in response would be like invading Mexico after the Japanese attacked us at Pearl Harbor in 1941. What Clarke could not have known with any certainty at the time, but may likely have feared, was that in addition to diverting vital resources from the hunt for Osama bin Laden and his minions, the March 2003 invasion of Iraq would enmesh the United States in a prolonged and debilitating insurgency with lasting domestic political and economic repercussions. Clarke's objections, however, fell on deaf ears in the Bush administration's determination to topple Saddam. The failure to uncover evidence of Iraq's production and stockpiling of weapons of mass destruction, the main justification for the US invasion of that country, would also deal a grievous blow both to domestic and worldwide confidence in American leadership. The United States' moral standing would suffer further with the revelations a year later of the abuses and incidents of torture at the notorious Abu Ghraib prison. For Al-Qaeda, the invasion could not have come at a more opportune time. It gave the movement the breathing space it needed to recoup and reorganize. The invasion further validated bin Laden's long-standing claims that the United States and the West were waging an aggressive war on Islam and Muslim peoples, which in turn allowed the movement to draw new recruits into its ranks. Bin Laden's declaration of war against the Americans, issued on August 23rd, 1996, had said exactly that. The Al-Qaeda leader had then painted a vivid picture of Islam under siege by the US and the West, whose intention, he stated, was to invade and occupy Muslim lands in order to control the region's oil supplies. His jeremiad about the suffering of Iraqi children as a result of the United Nations sanctions imposed following the 1991 First Gulf War was similarly felicitous. Bin Laden's nearly decade-old analysis must have struck both his followers and many others as prophetic in 2003. Indeed, al-Qaeda lost little time in preparing the ground for this golden opportunity to relieve pressure on the movement in South Asia and reposition al-Qaeda firmly at the forefront in the defense of Muslims and Muslim lands. During the weeks preceding the invasion, Saif al-Adil, one of the movement's most senior operational commanders, both then and indeed today, was busy resurrecting the call to foreign fighters that had sustained the Mujahideen struggle against the Red Army's occupation of Afghanistan 20 years earlier, and would prove pivotal in Iraq both between 2003 and 2009, and later during the Islamic State's reign over parts of that country in Syria from 2014 to 2019. In a series of articles posted on the internet in 2003 titled "In the Shadow of the Lances," al-Adil offered practical advice to the would-be foreign fighters that al-Qaeda was summoning to fight in Iraq, and explained how guerrilla warfare could be effectively employed against US and coalition forces. These calls to battle continued apace after US forces captured Baghdad in April 2003, with Al-Nida, al-Qaeda's main website of that time, trumpeting the virtues of using guerrilla warfare to target the infidel forces occupying one of Islam's storied capital cities. Al-Qaeda's propagandists skillfully invoked prominent lessons of history, including America's defeat in Vietnam and the Soviet armies in Afghanistan, in support of their argument. Under the caption, quote, "Guerrilla warfare is the most powerful weapon Muslims have, and it is the best method to continue the conflict with the crusader enemy," close quote. These treatises explained how this is the method that expelled the direct crusader colonialism from most of the Muslim lands, with Algeria the most well-known. That is the Algerian War for National Liberation of the 1950s against France. The document continued, the successful attempts of dealing defeat to invaders using guerrilla warfare were many, and we will not expound on them. However, these attempts have proven that the most effective method for the materially weak against the strong is guerrilla warfare. Al-Qaeda thus embraced with alacrity the opportunity that Iraq presented it to engage Islam's enemies in yet another theater of operation. This should have come as no surprise. Bin Laden himself had long extolled the asymmetric virtues of guerrilla warfare. Addressing the United States in the aforementioned 1996 declaration of war, Bin Laden had asserted that it must be obvious to you that due to the imbalance of power between our armed forces and the enemy forces, a suitable means of fighting must be adopted. In this case, using fast-moving, light forces that work under complete secrecy. In other words, Bin Laden continued, to initiate a guerrilla warfare where the sons of the nation and not the military forces take part in it. Later, in the run-up to the 2004 US presidential election, Bin Laden provided another lengthy disquisition on the ease with which al-Qaeda had been able, and I quote, to provoke and bait this administration and to cause America to suffer human, economic, and political losses without their achieving for it anything of note other than some benefits for their private companies. This, Bin Laden continued, is in addition to our having experience in using guerrilla warfare and the war of attrition to fight tyrannical superpowers, as we, alongside the Mujahideen, bled Russia for 10 years until it went bankrupt and was forced to withdraw. in defeat. In conclusion, bin Laden declared, "So we are continuing this policy in bleeding America to the point of bankruptcy. Allah willing, and nothing is too great for Allah," close quote. Within 2 years of its attack on 9/11, Al-Qaeda had thus locked the United States in 2 wars of attrition in 2 different regions, with all its deleterious consequences. As Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld lamented in December 2002, "We know that we're killing a lot, capturing a lot, collecting arms. We just don't know yet whether that's the same as winning." Nearly 2 decades later, we arguably still don't know the answer to that question. Around that time, too, Rumsfeld had also memorably explained how you go to war with the army you have, not the army you might want or wish to have at a later time, when he was challenged by US soldiers about the inadequacy of their equipment and insufficiently armored vehicles. That statement, however, was grossly misleading. From the time that he took office as Secretary of Defense, Rumsfeld had prioritized the transformation of the US military into a state-of-the-art 21st century fighting force. For Rumsfeld, the revolution in military affairs of the 1990s had fundamentally changed warfare and had obviated the need for large-scale troop deployments. The Secretary of Defense believed that a new generation of air-delivered, laser-guided, precision munitions, coupled with enhanced ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, could expeditiously vanquish any foe. The first Gulf War had demonstrated as much against the conventional enemy, and the invasion of Afghanistan had recently done so against an unconventional one. "I'm not sure," Rumsfeld observed, "that much force is needed given what we've learned coming out of Afghanistan." This basically was the planning guidance that Rumsfeld dispensed to General Tommy Franks in determining the size of the Iraqi invasion ground force. The unimpeded invasion and rapid collapse of Saddam's military appeared to have validated Rumsfeld's approach. It took only 20 days to capture Baghdad, and 5 weeks after it had begun, the Second Gulf War was over. In the Battle of Iraq, Bush famously declared on the flight deck of the USS Abraham Lincoln beneath a banner that read, "Mission accomplished. The United States and our allies have prevailed." But America's terrorist and insurgent enemies had other ideas. As Winston Churchill had long ago observed, however absorbed a commander may be in the elaboration of his own thoughts, it is sometimes necessary to take the enemy into consideration. Al-Qaeda's plans to make Iraq a hell on earth for the United States and its coalition partners was indeed succeeding. On the 3rd anniversary of the 9/11 attacks, Ayman al-Zawahiri lauded the movement's strategy. "The defeat of America in Iraq and Afghanistan," he declared, "has become only a matter of time. The Americans in both countries are between 2 fires. If they continue, they bleed to death. And if they withdraw, they lose everything." Although US military commanders optimistically described the influx of foreign fighters to Iraq occurring as a result of the invasion, of having cleverly created a terrorist flytrap that would attract and then facilitate the killing of Al-Qaeda terrorists, al-Zawahiri clearly had a very different perspective. 2 years after Tora Bora, he observed in December 2003, "The American bloodshed has started to increase in Iraq, and the Americans are unable to defend themselves." For Al-Qaeda, Iraq's preeminent utility was as an effective means to preoccupy US military forces and distract American attention from South Asia and elsewhere in the Middle East and North Africa. At this critical moment, Al-Qaeda was thus able to regroup and rebuild. The massive shift of US intelligence assets and other resources from Afghanistan and Pakistan to Iraq also likely contributed to bin Laden's ability to avoid detection until 2011, when he was finally cornered and killed by US Navy SEALs in Abbottabad. It is perhaps not entirely coincidental that the United States was then in the process of completing the withdrawal of the last of its military personnel from Iraq. Today, stability and security in Iraq remain perishable commodities. 19 years on, the seeds of democracy that the invasions, 18 years on, the seeds of democracy that the invasion's planners hoped to plant in Baghdad and thus germinate the entire region remain tragically unrequited. America's melancholy experience in Iraq has produced the unintended consequences of spreading continuing misery, death, and destruction, not only there, but to surrounding countries. And 20 years after liberating Afghanistan from Taliban rule, the United States has foolishly entered into a meretriciously rushed agreement that has every possibility of again returning the Taliban to power. So let me now move to the second part of the lecture. Are we at a crossroads or a cul-de-sac? That is a watershed moment or a dead end in the war on terror. The impetus today to end the war on terror is overwhelming. If there was one issue in the United States that united Republicans and Democrats alike during both the primary campaign leading to the 2020 US presidential election and the election itself, it was the bipartisan commitment, in former President Trump's words, to quote unquote, ending the era of endless wars. Writing in Foreign Affairs magazine, just as he clinched the nomination in March 2020, then candidate Joe Biden similarly explained how, and I quote, "It is past time to end the forever wars. Staying entrenched in unwinnable conflicts drains our capacity to lead on other issues that require our attention, and it prevents us from rebuilding the other instruments of American power," close quote. Thus, as the war on terror enters its third decade, the United States has to confront the question of whether it has reached a crossroads or a cul-de-sac, that is a dead end. Is some approximation of victory still attainable and even desirable? And if so, exactly how? Or is any continued effort likely to prove as ineffectual as before and hence is also doomed to failure? At the height of the Vietnam War in 1969, Henry Kissinger explained America's failure to win a decisive victory in that conflict. "We fought a military war," Kissinger wrote. "Our opponents fought a political one. We sought physical attrition. Our opponents aimed for our psychological exhaustion. In the process, we lost sight of one of the cardinal maxims of guerrilla war. The guerrilla wins if he does not lose. The conventional army loses if it does not win." Kissinger's diagnosis is especially applicable to America's experience with its war on terror. Except for brief interludes, the United States fought the war it wanted to fight, not the war that was. Like in Vietnam, the United States waged an overwhelmingly kinetic war. From the start, the US embraced physical attrition through invasion and occupation, and when that failed, moved on to terrorist leadership decapitation, while paying insufficient attention to the broader, contextual, environmental, and strategic issues that both facilitate these vital kinetic processes, but also that critically counter popular support for terrorists and insurgents. The American way of war thus has always relied on technological mastery and kinetics, a predilection confirmed by the lightning outcomes of the first Gulf War and the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq. But where occupation was avoided in 1991 by adherence to the United Nations Resolutions 660 and 678 with respect to Iraq, the terrorist and insurgent campaigns that emerged following the invasions of both Afghanistan and Iraq demanded a different strategy and more appropriate tactics. In both these situations, America's enemies were no longer established nation states with vast military apparata that could be found, targeted, destroyed, and defeated. Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, and subsequently the Islamic State were all transnational movements whose ideology of strident defense of Muslims and Muslim lands, as well as intrinsic narrative of grievance, resonated far beyond their respective loci of conflict. Hence, while the United States has been immensely successful tactically in killing or capturing key Al-Qaeda, Taliban, and Islamic State leaders, as well as their foot soldiers, we have been less successful in strategically countering their ideological appeal, their ability to radicalize new recruits, and continued capacity to energize sympathizers and supporters and thereby sustain their respective struggles. US strategy in the war on terrorism also assumed that these adversaries all had a traditional center of gravity and that they could be defeated primarily by targeting individual bad guys. The logical corollary, accordingly, was that the key commanders and their lieutenants simply needed to be killed or imprisoned, and that then global terrorism and insurgency would cease. The attention of the United States military and intelligence community thus focused on hunting down and eliminating militant leaders, and not necessarily toward understanding the core dynamic of our enemy's strategy, which relied as much on effective information operations as on violence. Decapitation strategies have, in any case, rarely worked in countering mass mobilization, terrorist, or insurgent campaigns. But also because with regard to both Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State, their ability to continue to prosecute their struggles are a direct reflection of their respective abilities to promote and ensure their durability as both an ideology and a concept. As Tina Brown, the doyen of postmodern media, memorably observed, the conjunction of 21st century internet speed and 12th century fanaticism has turned our world into a tinderbox. These messages of resistance, hatred, and intolerance have continued to resonate far beyond South Asia, the Arabian Peninsula, and the Levant to penetrate the entire Muslim world, including its Western diasporas. This led then Secretary of Defense Robert Gates to complain in 2007 that it is just plain embarrassing that Al-Qaeda is better at communicating its message on the internet than America. And again, a year later, when Gates observed, we're being out-communicated by a guy in a cave. It has not helped either that the United States has lacked a consistent strategy and cohesive approach to waging the war on terror. It has swung wildly from one extreme of invasion and occupation to the other, where even modest deployments of counterterrorism forces and intelligence assets overseas has become controversial. Accordingly, a light ground force footprint relying on American technological dominance that was embraced at the start of the war on terror evolved by necessity into increasingly larger ground deployments as a result of the multi-year surges in both Iraq and Afghanistan, then to politically popular drawdowns, to now, when even comparatively small deployments of advisory, training, intelligence, and other support personnel have become politically unpalatable. But a counterterrorism strategy where any overseas deployment of US military forces and intelligence assets on missions to train and support America's friends and allies becomes totally unacceptable is as fantastical as it is dangerous. Achieving the proper balance, given diminishing popular support and mounting fiscal challenges, further exacerbated by the coronavirus pandemic, necessitates an approach that more effectively combines kinetic and non-kinetic efforts as the war on terror enters its third decade. The much heralded war of ideas, more often than not, has been an afterthought, if it materialized at all, with accompanying initiatives of counter-radicalization and countering violent extremism, mostly ill-conceived, under-resourced, and poorly executed. Meanwhile, our enemies have not only survived, but have multiplied and diversified. Nearly a decade and a half ago, Secretary of Defense Gates cautioned, and I quote, "We can expect that as asymmetric warfare will be the mainstay of the contemporary battlefield for some time. These conflicts will be fundamentally political in nature and require the application of all elements of national power. Success," he continued, "will be less a matter of imposing one's will and more a function of shaping behavior of friends, adversaries, and most importantly, the people in between." This is a message that today many would prefer to ignore or dismiss. But as the war on terror is not going away, however much we may wish it would, but the war on terror is not going away, however much we may wish it would. As General James N. Mattis, then commander of the U.S. Central Command, observed in 2013, echoing the previous quote by Churchill, "No war is over until the enemy says it's over," General Mattis explained. "We may think it is over, we may declare it over, but in fact, the enemy gets a vote." Today, our enemies have incontrovertibly chosen to continue this war. Accordingly, defeating them will depend on the ability of American counterterrorism strategy and national security policy to adjust and adapt to changes we see in the nature and character of our adversaries and the struggles they are waging. This will entail the belated recognition of an uncomfortable reality that goes against the grain of the American way of war, that successfully countering terrorism and insurgency can never be an exclusively military endeavor, but must also entail the parallel political, social, economic, ideological, and informational activities that Gates recognized at a previously critical juncture in America's war on terrorism were absolutely required. As we have seen over the past 2 decades, the adversaries and the threats that the United States and other countries face are far too elusive and complicated to be vanquished by mere decapitation. Our strategy must therefore prioritize information operations with the same vigor and focus that our enemies have. As the American strategist Sean McFate has convincingly argued, and I quote, "The West needs to update its information warfare game. Until it does, it will continue to get outplayed by its enemies that wage war in the information space. And that's most everyone," close quote. Accordingly, absent this recognition, the American-led war on terror will remain stuck in the cul-de-sac or dead end it finds itself today, inherently reactive rather than proactive, deprived of a capacity to recognize, much less anticipate, important changes in our enemies' modi operandi, recruitment, and targeting. Success in this war's third decade will therefore depend on our ability to harness the technological mastery and overwhelming kinetic force of the US military as part of a more dedicated and comprehensive effort to better counter the ideology and narrative of our enemies and equip our regional and local friends and allies with the tools to also better resist these threats. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much to you for this very inspiring and interesting speech that really covers a lot of numbers of topics. So I will first exploit this time, having occasion to talk to you directly making a couple of comments and questions, and then I leave the floor to students for the debate. So the first comment, question, both of them, deals with Al-Qaeda and Al-Qaeda goals particularly. So if we assume, as I suppose to do, that Al-Qaeda was a rational actor, I wonder which was its aim making 9/11 terrorist attack. So there was a kind of awareness in Al-Qaeda leadership of the impact over the international system, or the leaders thought maybe that the final goal was to condition the narrow regional scenario. And that was the first question. The second one deals with victims and memory. So we know that 9/11 represented a kind of watershed in number of victims, as you rightly pointed out in your books. I mean, over the preceding 33 years, a total of no more than 1,000 Americans have been killed by terrorists, either overseas or even within the United States itself. And on 9/11, in less than 90 minutes, nearly 3 times that number were killed. So in other terms, to put those uniquely tragic events in a context, you rightly argued that during the entirety of the 20th century, no more than 14 terrorist operations kill more than 100 persons at any one time. So one of them was the Lockerbie bombing in 1988, which occurred 13 years before 9/11 and killed 270 persons. But the Lockerbie bombing was perceived as another story. When we assisted to 9/11 attacks, we got the impression that it was a new phenomenon, even if international terrorism has hit European countries for about 20 years. So why it was so? It was because it was really a new phenomenon. It was because of the lack of previous terrorism memory. And if we agree on this last point, how did this misperception condition our attitude and the state response toward terrorism?
Well,
so very long question.
No, those
to
are two
apologize.
excellent questions, especially that we need to reflect on 20 years later. Let me point out too that as you can see, I finally have ascended to this status in life where I'm a true graybeard. I was across the street from the Pentagon when American Airlines Flight 77 crashed into it. So and I'm a native New Yorker, so the events of 9/11 are as close to me now as they were then when I was in close proximity to the Pentagon and indeed lost friends in the Twin Tower destruction. And I think it's hard 2 decades later, after everything that has happened in the world, not least the coronavirus. I mean, forget about terrorism. We've lost 3.5 million persons throughout the world to the pandemic, which I think goes to the heart of your question is what is it that makes terrorism different, which I'll get to in a moment. And that's, I think, why these are so important to reflect on right now. Well, from what we know, Al-Qaeda's goal and aim in September 11th was, as we've often seen with terrorism, I mean, terrorism, the media often portrays terrorism as, these irrational, homicidal fanatics. And what we fail to appreciate is that there's an inner logic or indeed a strategy that motivates all terrorism. I mean, all terrorism is planned, premeditated, and purposeful. So the terrorists have a clear outcome, which of course goes beyond what President Bush was asking. He was saying, why do they hate us? That was not so much the issue. I would argue that bin Laden sincerely believed that by targeting the 3 symbols or the 3 pillars of American strength, its financial might, which was the attack on the Twin Towers in Wall Street, one of the financial centers of the world, its military might, which was the attack on the Pentagon, and then the plane that United Airlines Flight 93 that was crashed into a field outside of Shanksville, Pennsylvania, when the passengers arose and attempted to regain control of the plane, and then it plummeted to the ground. That was headed for the United States Capitol. And I think that bin Laden clearly believed that if he could inflict this kind of punishment on the United States and strike at the three pillars of American strength, the United States would change its foreign policy. It would stop supporting Israel, for example, which of course remains a very prominent issue, not least in the past few weeks. It would withdraw its military forces from Saudi Arabia, which had been there for more than a decade, to protect the kingdom against an invasion by Iraq. This was always an affront to bin Laden that infidel military forces were in the Arabian Peninsula, in the same territory where Islam's two holiest cities, Mecca and Medina, were, that this would precipitate a withdrawal of the United States from backing what he alleged were the corrupt, reprobate, unreformable anti-Islamic regimes in the Middle East, and that it would create, to use a phrase that was common at the time, a new world order. This, I think, is one of the weaknesses of terrorists, which should play to our advantage much more than it does, is that terrorists believe their own propaganda. They often live in a fantasy world, in a very closed world where there's not open debate and discussion, but where they fixate on a particular idea and are unpersuaded from it. We're all taught in history classes that history doesn't repeat itself. But for terrorists and also for dictators, they always seem to believe that history will repeat itself and that through some exertion, they will once again be successful. So for bin Laden, there were, and I would argue this is extremely relevant to today as well. Back in 2001, for bin Laden, there were two models that he believed could be replicated by the 9/11 attacks. The first was Hezbollah's suicide attack on the US Marine barracks in October 1993, that despite President Reagan's declarations that the United States wouldn't be intimidated by terrorists, within 4 months, the United States had withdrawn the Marines from part of the multinational peacekeeping force that was attempting to stabilize Lebanon and restore order there. His view was that the killing of 241 Marines had changed US policy. Then we have to go to 1993, to Somalia, when the United States was participating in the United Nations sponsored Operation Restore Hope, which was again to stabilize Somalia, to feed the starving there. And bin Laden's forces, as we know now, were training and arming the irregular forces of the Somali warlord, Mohammed Farah Aidid, that in fact had participated in the famous events that are depicted in the book and the film Black Hawk Down, where 18 US Delta Force commandos and Army Rangers were killed. A captured US helicopter pilot was dragged through the streets of Mogadishu. And immediately, President Clinton announced that the United States was withdrawing from the United Nations operation in Somalia. And much like in Lebanon, a decade before, that precipitated the complete collapse of this multinational effort. And bin Laden at the time had reflected that it took the deaths of 241 Marines in 1983, but the deaths of only 18 American soldiers a decade later to convince the United States to leave Somalia. So you can see why, rationally, he fastened on a strategy that if we can strike in the United States, and not only that, strike simultaneously, and assault these pillars, in the case of the Pentagon, one of the most protected buildings in the world, if the United States changed its policies twice before, it's certainly going to do so again. What bin Laden failed to account for was the resolve of the United States and the shock that it caused, which was a rallying cry to action, not to retreat. The international coalition that was assembled against al-Qaeda, and then I would argue his most fatally false assumption was the fact that Pakistan allied itself with the United States and permitted its territory to be used as a conduit to move men and material, particularly war-making material from Karachi and other ports through the Khyber Pass to Afghanistan. That was something, of course, the Soviet Union during its occupation of Afghanistan could not rely upon, and bin Laden totally miscalculated. So that was, I think, the motivation on Al-Qaeda's part for 9/11, to deal a knockout blow. And this is why Al-Qaeda had shifted from its strategy earlier in the 1990s of attacking the near enemy, these corrupt, reprobate, anti-Islamic, or what they alleged to be anti-Islamic regimes ruling in the Middle East, that they believed only survived with the United States backing, with the attempts to overthrow the Mubarak regime in Egypt, to overthrow the Saud dynasty in Saudi Arabia failed. This is why they turned to a strategy of far enemy, attacking the United States, in the assumption if you knocked out the puppet master, the puppets would then fall. It proved to be a grievous miscalculation in that respect, but that was, I think, very clearly the motivation. Certainly the work of Peter Bergen, one of the few people, Western journalists, to have interviewed bin Laden, of Lawrence Wright in his book, The Looming Tower, and numerous other studies, I think, have borne out that and the 9/11 Commission's report has borne out that in brief, that was Al-Qaeda's rationale or strategy. Now, your question on victims in memory is much more complex, but I think is very important to understanding where we are in the war on terror today. I think actually the world's perception of terrorism changed on September 11th, 2001. I mean, hitherto to countries like Italy, especially, that were enmeshed for more than a decade in the years of lead imposed by the Red Brigades in Prima Lina and other far left organizations as well, one has to say, of neo-fascist extreme right-wing terrorists as well. And for the United States, countering terrorism was seen as primarily a criminal initiative, whereas all terrorist acts are crime. You mobilize the police and law enforcement, you arrest the perpetrators, you try them, and you put them in jail. 9/11, I think, underscored for many countries, especially the United States, but also for other countries as well, that terrorism had assumed the dimensions of a transnational and international security threat to an extent we had never seen before. I think one key reason of that, which Professor Lomolini, you mentioned, is the fact that so many people were killed in such a brief period of time. I mean, it was almost 10 times not quite, but about 8 or 9 times the previous record of the number of persons killed in a single terrorist incident. And this gave rise to profound fears that this new breed of terrorism, animated, inspired by divine decree, let's say, or divine ordination rather than political ideologies, wouldn't stop there. I mean, this was, the famous statement of then Vice President Dick Cheney about, there's 1% chance that terrorists might use a weapon of mass destruction. We're going to do everything to stop that. And that's where I think one of the biggest problems, which was a problem of nomenclature, was embraced that has had severe negative repercussions. And that was, in the United States, we called it a war on terror and not a war on terrorism. And that's enormously important because terror is an emotion. And basically, you could argue anything that scares you then justifies military violence. And of course, that was precisely the rationale that justified the invasion of Iraq. If Iraq was developing weapons of mass destruction, as it was alleged, that justified the invasion. But the key is, if it was a war on terrorism, it would have been something different. Because at least in my view, the ISM is very important because that indicates that it's about achieving political change and that you can only respond to something when you at least recognize the grievances that motivate terrorism. And as I've argued in this paper, not just use military and kinetic force, but have the requisite non-kinetic tools as well. Political reform, economic reform, and information operations. Lockerbie, I think, may have played into convincing bin Laden, although there's no evidence. There's evidence that certainly Beirut and Mogadishu had a huge impact on it. And I would argue I mean, look, 4 times in the past 40 years, the United States has changed its policy dramatically because of terrorism. 1983 has Bin Laden recognized, 1993 has Bin Laden argued, 2011, the withdrawal from Iraq, and then now I would argue the withdrawal from Afghanistan. And in each instance, that's led to more terrorism, not less. But this is what I think motivates and infuses terrorists. They believe that these tactical successes eventually will accrue into a much broader strategic triumph. But Lockerbie, I mean, the United States didn't do anything. This is the reality. The attack at Lockerbie in December 1988 was in the middle of the transition from 2 terms of President Reagan to newly elected President H.W. Bush, President George W. Bush's father. And the United States didn't do anything. I mean, think about it. The United States also didn't do anything after the USS Cole was attacked in October 1999. And all these things convinced Bin Laden that bringing the war to the United States and meshing the American people in this struggle would have a decisive outcome, which of course he miscalculated. But at the same time, that may have been a major miscalculation. But it's astonishing to me that Al-Qaeda, which was founded in 1988, is over 30 years old and is still exists, still hasn't been extinguished, which is why I argued in my lecture, we need a different approach. What we've been doing isn't working.
Thank you very much for this very interesting response. If I may add something to the first comment, to comment on your first comment, on your first response, starting from my own research, I think that probably another reasons behind Bin Laden idea that we would affect, I mean, with this terrorist attack, the international system and to change, to condition the US foreign policy was the effectiveness of the use of the so-called coercive diplomacy in Europe that was developed, you know, during the 70s and the 80s and produced a kind of appeasement from the European countries. So it was very effective by the end. So that's, if I may add something to these very interesting hints that you provided us. And this also brings me to the last point I would like to make before opening the floor to the students, which deals with the US and European attitude toward terrorism. We talked this morning about the crisis management by the European Union. And I would like to quote Robert Kagan's book of Paradise and Power, dealing with trying to explain the perennial transatlantic disputes over the exercise of power in international relations. So Robert Kagan said that Americans are from Mars and Europeans are from Venus. So I wonder, what do you think about the new President Joe Biden's decision to withdraw from Afghanistan with that regard? So which could be its impact, the impact of this decision over the fight against terrorism as a global threat? And if we could use this Kagan paradigm, can we argue that nowadays both Europe and the US are from Venus?
That's a very good point, a very astute observation. I think you're absolutely right. Well, clearly the United States has moved into a mindset, where, as I said in my talk, where even a very modest military commitment, I mean, 3,000 or 3,500 US troops in Afghanistan is less than, 0.2% of active US military forces. I don't understand why that's a luxury we can't afford. And by the way, a lot of the discussion now is about not bringing those troops home, but redeploying them to surrounding countries, to Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan, and establishing bases there to project power into Afghanistan. So this idea that that it's so critically important to withdraw these troops so we could focus them on great power rivalries when there's simultaneous talks to still keep them in the region, strikes me as very curious, which underscores that 2 points. First, every single president since the war on terrorism, which is how I prefer to describe it, began has declared victory. I mean, it's just politically enormously appealing. President Biden is included in that. President Trump did it on multiple occasions, President Obama and President Bush. As General Mattis famously said, the enemy gets a vote. It's a bit precipitous. But secondly, for Europe and the United States, especially with our economies having been so battered by the coronavirus, apart from many other things, I mean, this is just the latest blow, it is undeniably politically appealing to withdraw from global commitments. I mean, firstly, in many of our countries, there's a homegrown form of populism and of even xenophobia taking hold that sees these foreign conflicts as not only endlessly entangling, but of inviting waves of immigrants into one's country that has become increasingly controversial. So it's become politically extremely desirable. And that you're right with the Venus comparison for many countries to say, you know, we've had enough of the war on terrorism. Looking towards the future in the Afghanistan withdrawal, like all these things, I think it's more complex than many people imagine. I think it's going to be disastrous and it's a tremendous mistake. Firstly, maybe I'm old-fashioned like Robert Kagan, but I believe in then Secretary of State Powell's Pottery Barn rules, where he advised President Bush, if you invade Iraq, if you break it, you own it. We invaded Afghanistan and Iraq. We established with our European and other allies democratically elected governments in both places, that for all the problems that exist, those democracies are still functioning, admittedly with many problems, but I don't think there's any country in the world that has transitioned from a different form of government to democracy that hasn't faced enormous challenges in the first 2 or 3 decades, if not more, including the United States. And I would argue we still owe something to those countries, especially because the peoples in those countries do not want to exist under the totalitarian rule of whether it's the Islamic State or whether it's the Taliban. So there's a moral commitment, although at times of realpolitik that may matter less. My fear is not, as some people have argued, even though I'm a sort of a hardliner on the Afghanistan issue, that I don't believe we withdraw. I remember very clearly when I was a university student, the events in April 1975, when the ignominious retreat of the United States from Vietnam and the effects it had on world stability and order. I don't think it's coincidental that 4 years later, the Soviet Union was emboldened to invade and occupy Afghanistan and what it perceived as US weakness, that Iran then seized the 52 American hostages that were held for 444 days. All these things have a price. We tend to want to view terrorism as something that's peripheral and a lesser included contingency, but I think historically we see the terrorists feel emboldened, which is a problem. Even in my pessimism about the outcome of Afghanistan, I don't believe that Afghanistan has become a base for Al Qaeda to launch attacks against the United States or even Europe. I think that possibility exists one way or the other. What worries me about Afghanistan is that Al Qaeda will turn it into a base to destabilize South Asia. And what we see in a globalized world is that destabilization in one region doesn't remain confined there. We have very short memories with terrorism because so much happens just in the past few weeks or months. We forget what happened 12 or 13 years ago. But a very close Al Qaeda ally, Lashkar-e-Taiba, launched simultaneous suicide attacks in Mumbai, India in November 2008 that nearly brought India and Pakistan to the brink of nuclear war. I believe that Al Qaeda is intent on precipitating another such conflict, of undermining the security and stability of India, of Bangladesh, of Nepal and other countries. It's interesting that the two most recent Al Qaeda franchises that were established were Al Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent and an Al Qaeda franchise in Kashmir. So this is clearly their goal, and I think the global repercussions will be quite serious. And again, it's a modest commitment of troops now, which I don't understand has become politically unsustainable.
I would have 1,000 of questions, but I don't feel appropriate just to ask by myself. So I will immediately leave the floor to students and to open a discussion. So we already have several questions. So I kindly ask to Arthur O'Connor to ask the question he would like to ask to Professor Hoffman.
Firstly, thank you for a wonderful talk, Professor Hoffman. Just following the theme of trying different approaches, my question is basically that increasingly it's a theme that social media and cryptocurrencies are both being utilized by extremist groups and networks. And in that kind of international response that has never really happened towards financing terrorism from both Eastern and Western states, do you see any imminent shift in policy towards tech giants or the cryptocurrency market in the name of curtailing extremist activity from the international community? Thank you.
That's a great and very important question, and also gets us away from the Salafi jihadi threat to the threat from, particularly, I would argue, violent far-right extremists, but also violent far-left extremists and others in criminal syndicates. Well, with respect to social media, my view, I think Europe is doing much better than the United States is in this regard, and certainly the European Union has put into place protections, data protections that don't exist in this country that I think we're indebted to the EU for embarking upon. Certainly countries like Australia, New Zealand, France, United Kingdom have recognized that the law has not kept pace with technology, and that many of the legal provisions about the internet, which were put in place in the 1990s, completely different world. That was a time when everyone got their news from traditional media sources, whether it was newspapers or radio or TV. I mean, now we're in a completely different world where more people get their news from Facebook than from all those other traditional media sources combined. And beyond any doubt, and we saw this on January 6th in the United States, social media has been weaponized and has become a tool of radicalization and recruitment to an extent that's been unimaginable. And again, I think Europe is reacting better and faster in also holding the tech giants and their executives accountable than the United States has moved in this regard. But this is going to be, I think, one of the really critical issues in the future is that, you know, I'm old enough to remember in the 1990s when these laws were passed, the internet was seen as this tool of bringing the truth to everyone, of educating the world and putting everyone on an equal plane that would banish falsehoods. I mean, this sounds absolutely ridiculous now, but I remember very clearly in the 1990s. But you have to think back, you know, there was something called Netscape. That was the internet, and there were no images at all. I mean, you couldn't upload music really. I mean, it was a very primitive type of state, which probably led to a very primitive and optimistic assumption that is just being repeatedly destroyed, whether it's Salafi jihadists, whether it's state actors, or whether it's ideological extremists that have used social media as a means to radicalize and recruit, to harass, to intimidate, and to organize terrorist plots. So we need to do much more in that respect. I would argue that for a brief window of time, which is typical of the history of terrorism, there was a united global front in countering terrorist finances. And that was in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, where there was tremendous international cooperation for a few years. But that's the problem, I think, always with terrorism, is one can make progress internationally or transnationally amongst governments, but sustaining it, even when you've made this improvement, is what has always been elusive. So in other words, even in the finance realm, we undermine the charities that were seen as the main, these illicit charities that were funneling money to terrorist groups in the early 2000s, and then forgot about it. And international cooperation has eroded. And meanwhile, exactly my point with social media, the law has not kept pace with technology. And cryptocurrencies have now appeared, which I would argue are so poorly understood, I think, by most people in the world. And that's part of the issue too, is we have elected representatives that are closer to my age than your age and have absolutely no conceptualization. I mean, we've seen this in Congress, how, elderly senators have no idea how the internet works. I mean, it defies the imagination. And that's why I think there's really been no efforts at addressing the cryptocurrency emergence and its growing popularity and its exploitation for illicit purposes. And we saw this in the United States just a couple of weeks ago with the Colonial Pipeline ransomware attack, where the ransom was paid. And one has to ask, not just in the United States, but around the world, I mean, what are governments doing to prevent this from happening in the future? That's the problem with paying ransom, is the problem doesn't go away. It just continues to resurface because you can make money from it. So this is one of the challenges. We may all, in many countries, not we in this call, but turn our backs on terrorism, view it as an anachronism, want to move away from this very long struggle. But as your question, I think, exemplifies, terrorism is constantly changing and evolving. It's a dynamic phenomenon. And we're only as good at countering it when we can basically keep up with those changes. But most of the time, we're reacting rather than putting in place the defenses or very quickly identifying the legal remedies that we need. It's only after it becomes a huge problem. And even then, like with the Colonial Pipeline, it's not always that we do anything about it.
Well, thank you so much. We have another question. Nadezhda Orzan.
Professor Hoffman, Professor Melini, organizers of the Spring School, thank you very much for this opportunity to ask the question actually related to today's topic, and also Professor Hoffman to one of your previous articles, specifically victims of terrorism. So we can see an example of associations that were created after 9/11 who influenced a lot to the work of 9/11 Commission and actually succeeded in their demands for government accountability. But in the case of Beslan terrorist attack, which happened 3 years later after 9/11, also victims and families of victims organized same associations as Mothers of Beslan or Voice of Beslan, and they tried to force the Russian government to conduct the just investigation, since the reports of the official Beslan Commission didn't satisfy their questions. But they were not successful in reaching the main objective, which was accountability of the Russian government. So even the involvement of European Court of Human Rights, which gave its own results of investigation in 2017, didn't make a big impact. So in your opinion, Professor Hoffman, what do you think can be a strategy for victims, especially in authoritarian regimes where the human rights are not respected? Thank you very much in advance.
Well, this is very relevant too to the discussions in the United States about a commission to investigate the January 6th attack on the Capitol. That's one of the main differences from September 11th, is that there were these, the families and the friends of the persons who perished or were injured that day that were so effective. I mean, it was really their pressure on Congress and the White House, when both Republican side in Congress and President Bush were very reluctant to approve a commission, that resulted in the 9/11 Commission being created. So now we understand there's no such body of victims, really. I mean, the US Capitol Police has issued a statement about the importance of having a commission, but it's just not as widespread or powerful as people in a number of different states were. The Beslan incident in September 2004 is enormously important on multiple levels. Firstly, it showed how, especially in the West, that sometimes the reporting of terrorism is so skewered, because almost all of the newspaper accounts describe the terrorists who seize these school children and their parents and their guardians and their grandparents, as militants, as fighters, as extremists. Very rarely were they referred to at all as terrorists, which is part of the problem. We become afraid sometimes to call something what it is. Even in the case of January 6th, although between January 6th and the inauguration on January 21st, there was debate whether it was an act of terrorism. But of course, in his inaugural address, President Biden called it, said it was an act of domestic terrorism. And then the following Saturday, then minority leader of the Senate, Mitch McConnell, also said it was an act of domestic terrorism. So that debate is over. Beslan also, I think fascinatingly, in part accounted for President Bush's reelection in 2004. I mean, I refer to my address to bin Laden's speech of October 30th, 2004, when he talked about how he was going to bleed the United States to death. But that drove home the fears of many people that a Beslan could occur in any country, that terrorists anywhere could seize school children as hostages, and that governments would be unprepared to react. In answer to your specific question, this, I think, illustrates the complexity of the times we live in. In response to the previous question, I had talked about the pernicious or the negative impacts of social media. But of course, social media has an enormously positive effect to play as well in rallying citizens, in communicating information that governments don't wish to hear, and in focusing attention on issues. Now, even in Beslan, there was no social media at that time. But I would argue today it would be a different situation, and that the aggrieved and the downtrodden still can mobilize social media as a platform to achieve change and to certainly to scare their political opponents. And this is precisely why we have the incident that occurred yesterday, where a Ryanair flight en route from Athens to Vilnius, when it was over Belarus airspace, was commandeered and forced to land, so that an opposition leader who incurred the wrath of the Belarus strongman, Lukashenko, because of the blog that he wrote, because it threatened the regime. So it also shows, I think, the power of social media in mobilizing victims of oppression. And that's where there's a positive dimension. But how we balance this out, the positive opportunities of social media with the more negative ones, I think remains a challenge. But your question, I think, also underscores that we often forget about the victims of terrorism and the trauma that they sustain and the damage that's done to their lives. We see in the media that far more attention is lavished on the terrorists and on the perpetrators than on the victims, which is something that I think creates this imbalance and also inspires even more terrorism.
You again. So we have here Elia Salomone.
Yes, thank you, Professor Lomellini, and thank you, Professor Hoffman, for the inspiring talk and argument in general. My question was about one of your previous articles, which is Terrorism in History. And my question was about the fact that the presence of leaders like Yasser Arafat and bin Laden have greatly affected the features of Arab propaganda in terroristic operations and organization. So given the fact that nowadays we cannot say that there are leaders that stand under the spotlight like Arafat and bin Laden, how these new features of the Arab terroristic organizations have changed the terroristic propaganda itself and their claims in general?
Well, I mean, this is a very good point. I'm so impressed that so many of you have read these very old articles of mine that I have to struggle to actually remember. And that article about terrorism in history was meant to show that even though we wish there's a tendency to ignore terrorism, it's had profounder effects on world events than sometimes we're willing to admit. I mean, one thinks of it, the two most consequential conflicts of the 20th and the 21st centuries were both precipitated by an act of terrorism. I mean, 9/11, of course, but I'm thinking of the events in Sarajevo in June 2014 when Gavrilo Princip assassinated the heir to the Habsburg throne, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. I mean, it's interesting that we're poised, I think, at a critical juncture in terrorism. on the one hand, we have the movements that I described in the paper, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Hamas, Hezbollah. We have the more traditional types of movements that are clearly identifiable, have a command and control structure, have leaders that issue statements and issue orders and instructions. And that's the kind of terrorism that we've been used to for decades, for the past, one could argue, certainly century and a half. The problem, I think, less so in the Middle East, but more so in the United States and in Europe and in Australia, and it's more particular amongst far-right extremists, to an extent far left, but more far-right, is we don't see organizations, identifiable organizations anymore with definable leaders actually issuing commands or disseminating propaganda. We see much more of a grassroots type of movement where persons exchange information, where they drift from group to group, for example, where they cooperate with one another, but where the sort of very clear lines of identification once exist have eroded now and become much more amorphous and diffuse. And the problem is the old terrorist organizations haven't gone away, but yet we're confronted now by this newer phenomena, which I think has created lots of strains and stresses on law enforcement and intelligence agencies that have to contend with new threats that are much more difficult to identify, and where mobilization is more a collective activity than a top-down command and control phenomena. So whereas in the past we could identify individuals and demonize them, whether it was Arafat or Osama bin Laden, or in the struggles, let's say, against British rule of Palestine, Menachem Begin and others, it's much harder. For instance, on January 6th, apart from President Trump, which some persons identify as the leader of the insurrection that day, who was the leader? And it becomes so much more complicated. And this is one of the reasons why I think Congress feels so challenged now in creating a January 6th commission, because they're not sure in some quarters, what the purpose would be, because there is no leadership to identify.
Thank you very much. So maybe Kristina Balatova?
Thank you very much for your lecture. My question is related to the counter-terrorist measures of the United Kingdom government. The government implemented a multi-pronged anti-terror approach, which includes legislation, law enforcement. And my questions are, does the government cooperate with Muslim religious leaders in the UK in order to prevent the appearance of Islamist radicals? And are there any governmental actions aimed at religious assimilation of the Muslim population, which is considered to be the youngest in the UK? Thank you very much.
Yeah, the United Kingdom embarked on a very ambitious counterterrorism strategy as part of its prevent strategy, which included very active outreach to Muslim communities, the enlistment of Muslim clerics to assist in this. And I think with most counterterrorism initiatives is that because terrorism itself is constantly changing and evolving, as I described, is so different in different countries, is that a lot of complications or problems that then arise aren't anticipated. And in some cases, rather than creating dialogue, these types of efforts created more estrangement between the community and the government, where the Muslim community in the United Kingdom felt that they were being singled out and victimized as a collective and blamed for the violence of a few extremists, where they believed that these cooperative measures with the government brought increased governmental security and intrusiveness on their livelihood. And I think the United Kingdom discovered that there was really no easy answer, although many of its initiatives, though, have been successful and at least mitigating somewhat the disenfranchisement of communities that felt very much excluded and ignored, and in some cases victimized. So it brought both some successes, but some weaknesses. But as we've often seen, the uneven application and unanticipated problems and consequences that arose. I think that the United Kingdom, that both the successes and failures are a very useful model that can be at least studied by other countries so as not to make this same mistakes. That said, I think a lot of the previous experience, which, as I said, has been uneven in the United Kingdom, did culminate, though, in the white paper that was issued in March 2019 by the Ministry of Home Affairs and the Ministry of Sport, Culture, and Digital Media. It was the Online Harms White Paper, which described government's role in protecting its citizens from abuses that occur over social media. And I think this was a very important step forward that could not have emerged had there not been the experience of working with communities on very difficult issues for the previous decade plus. And the online harms, I think, was very useful. It wasn't only about counterterrorism or counter-radicalization, it was also about countering cyberbullying, sexual exploitation of minors, for example, and laid out very clearly government responsibility, but also the responsibilities of the tech giants and even of the executives in those tech companies. And I would argue that the Online Harms White Paper, which was supposed to be adopted as legislation the following fall, but then a combination of the Brexit vote, the UK change of government, of course, then the coronavirus pandemic derailed it. But this got the attention of the social media tech firms much more than anything else had done. And again, as I said, you have to look at that as a progression from understanding how you protect communities from being preyed upon.
Thank you so much. So, Professor Hoffman, we still have 2-3 questions. Could we abuse of your time, or is too much? I don't want to be.
As long as you have the time, I'm happy to.
Thank you very much for your availability. So I can leave the floor to Anna Percolla.
I think you're on mute.
Well, yeah.
Sorry. Good afternoon to everybody. Mine is just a simple question, which is, why does international terrorism generally gain more public attention than domestic terrorism? Because it seems that people fear terrorism, international terrorism, more than their domestic terrorism.
That's a very good question. I mean, it's easier to focus on non-domestic. Well, let me back up. Terrorism doesn't occur in a vacuum, even though the media often depicts it that terrorism comes out of nowhere. That's certainly not true. I mean, terrorism, erupts and flourishes in different places at different times due to, I would argue, an idiosyncratic combination of factors that makes it very difficult to predict. But also, it's much easier to demonize the other, or to blame the other, or to focus on a foreign threat than to address domestic political problems or disparities in socioeconomic development or political disenfranchisement that may give rise to domestic violence and may raise uncomfortable questions about income distribution, about the equity of representation in parliaments and in Congress. And therefore, there's just a default, there's just a preference to focus on foreign or external threats rather than the internal challenges, which may necessitate considerable adjustments or reforms. So historically, I would argue that's often been the case. It's been far more prevalent to dismiss internal threats compared to external ones. Sometimes not even to call the internal ones terrorism. I mean, this is part of the controversy that I talked about a few minutes ago, where it wasn't until President Biden on his inauguration and then Minority Leader McConnell a few days later actually called it domestic terrorism, that at least in the United States, we reached some closure that this was the proper way to describe it. But even now, we have all sorts of, fictitious tales of that the protesters that came into the insurrectionists that came into the U.S. Capitol were just, the same as sightseers and visitors on a normal day into the Capitol. And that, to me, underscores how countries are very quick to point the finger at other countries or at external threats, but are much more reluctant to admit internal problems because of the repercussions and the consequences that that recognition necessarily brings.
Now, so there is Veronica Capenti.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you to Professor Hoffman for the insightful speech, and thank you to Professor Lomellini for giving me the opportunity to intervene. Actually, my question is related to the conclusions of your speech, notably the need to regain the ability to predict evolutions in terrorist modus operandi. And in this sense, I wonder if there might be today a correlation between COVID-19 and the level of terroristic threat. More specifically, I reflected upon the use of the internet as a tool for terroristic purposes, such as like recruitment and propaganda, to name a few. And my question is, do you think that COVID-19 pandemic has contributed to increasing this strategy? And if we take this considerations to the broader level of cyber terrorism and pure cyber terrorism, do you believe that this renewed impact of technologies due to the pandemic is able to foster a real and concrete cyber terroristic attack?
That's a very good question. It depends. On the one hand, I think international terrorism has decreased because of the coronavirus. And we saw this last year where the Islamic State, for example, issued guidance to its fighters not to travel, to remain in place. I mean, this resulted in a 25% increase in terrorist attacks in Iraq, for example, last summer. But you've seen less international terrorism as international travel has been curtailed. Now that obviously is likely to change as people start to travel more and feel safer. So to date, we've had fewer, it's been led to a diminishment of international terrorism. But it surely has led to an increase of domestic terrorism in many countries. It's certainly empowered xenophobes, racists, anti-Semites, anti-immigrant groups to seize upon the coronavirus and blame their enemies now for even inflicting this disease against, completely divorced from reality. But the power of social media has enabled them to seize upon the coronavirus as yet another propaganda platform to attack, to demonize, to belittle, to disenfranchise their enemies. And we see this in so many countries domestically, where I think the threat of in my view, terrorism and hate crimes are the same thing. I mean, they're both politically motivated. In the United States, I think, because again, going back to a previous question, we don't like to talk about domestic terrorism. So we call it something different. We call it a hate crime. Absolutely no difference in my view. They both have a political purpose, which of course is at the heart of terrorism. And the political purpose is the subjugation of another race, religion, gender, and so on. So that's, I think, been the problem in the coronavirus, is that we're still at a phase in many countries where we don't understand the power of social media to create falsehoods and fictions that become not just widely believed by segments of the population. Look at this QAnon phenomena. I mean, one has to be embarrassed, as an American, that this originated in the United States and is now spreading to many other countries. And it goes back to my other point that years ago, when we actually could get a handle on the dimension of the threat through the speech, the declarations of people like bin Laden, who actually articulated their thoughts, we may not have believed him when he declared war on the United States in 1996 and 1998. In fact, we disbelieved him at our peril. But we had an outright statement. Now, when we have movements without leaders, these ideas circulate. They affect clearly parts of the population. But also what worries me is we see increasingly populist leaders seizing upon these falsehoods and saying because they're all over the internet, therefore they must be true, and using them as a vehicle to gain more power and more influence and to further divide our already heavily polarized societies. So clearly, I think the world will never reset to the way we were at the beginning of March 2020. I think we're struggling now as we're emerging from a year of lockdown and of self-imposed staying at home. We don't know how things are going to change. Fascinatingly, I was just reading in the Washington Post this morning how political leaders in the United States are increasingly worried because for a year they communicated with their constituents as we're doing, over the internet or over Zoom or Teams or, one of these platforms. But now there's a demand for their constituents to meet them in person, to have speeches and gatherings, which of course they're very enthusiastic about, except in one area. They're very concerned about security and about the divisiveness that's been created during the coronavirus. And many are saying, we can't go out into shopping malls or to theaters or parks with the same kind of security we had 18 months ago today, given how violently inclined some people are, but just the nature of the dialogue because of the coronavirus. When, as we know, people post things on social media, say things in email that they would never say in person to one another. But nonetheless, words matter and words can be weaponized and can be enlisted in violence.
Yeah, I do share this opinion and also these doubts, about the post-COVID-19 emergency. That will be then another, we need another keynote speech about that, I guess. So, last question by Leonardo Daziani.
Thank you, Professor, once again for the opportunity. And thank you, of course, Professor Hoffman, for the very inspiring speech, very interesting. So I will try to, because that's the moment in which I found a possible question, both from your publication, your article regarding the victims of terrorism, but also the conclusion of your speech, so regarding the possibility that military capabilities are not enough nowadays to contrast in some way terrorism. And so my question is, with respect to the different organizational forms in which the victims of terrorism have joined together, a common element which seems to emerge is the attempt to diversify their initiatives to put pressure on the governments with respect to negligence or even inability to provide sufficient measures. So is it possible, therefore, that a gray area exists with respect to the historical memory of terrorism? And if so, wouldn't an important point of reference to avoid the mistakes of the past, particularly in communication, and take an important step in the direction of a more inclusive, I would say popular and informative strategy be lost in some way? Thank you.
Part of my argument is that as satisfying as military force is and as simple as that solution may be, because soldiers do it, and airmen and Navy sailors do what they're ordered to do, it hasn't worked. So we have to find a different approach. And I think, again, I don't think we can dispense with the use of military force. We can't dispense with criminal prosecution either. But it's never an either or. We can't dispense with information operations that are designed to persuade people or to wean them away from extremist messages. It has to be all those things. And that's what I think is being so elusive over the past 20 years, is that we instinctively know that it has to be a combination, but we constantly fall back on the use of force or on locking people up and treating it as individual problems rather than a continuum. And in our desire to now end the war on terror, to minimize the threats as they exist, we do a grave disservice, I think, to the victims of terrorism, who, firstly, we have to understand their pain as well, and have to understand that it's the responsibility of governments to protect their their citizens, but to do so prudently and rationally. Part of the problem with the war on terrorism, at least from the United States perspective, is in that desire to protect our population. We launched an expansive war that really had no end. So why should we be surprised 20 years later that it's still waging? We launched a war on terror, as I said earlier, that was to combat an emotion, fear and anxiety, which meant that everything that scared you was fair game. So we have to be, I think, much more focused. And one of the messages of my lecture too is that we have to be much more consistent, because it's this inconsistency when we think we're on the verge and politicians declare we've defeated Al-Qaeda or defeated the Islamic State, we take our foot off the gas pedal and we relax. And this creates time and time again the breathing space where terrorist groups can regroup and reorganize and once again become threatening. Not only that, in the 21st century, what we see is that inconsistency not only results in the resurrection of these terrorist threats that we thought we've defeated, but also provides new opportunities for some of our enemies to intervene. So in Iraq, let's say we created opportunities for Iran to influence domestic events in that country to the greatest extent that in centuries. In Syria, we opened the door to Russian intervention, to intervention by Iran as well, intervention by Turkey and other countries. In Libya too, the inconsistency of the Western approach to Libya opened up Russian intervention, the use of Russian mercenaries as part of the Wagner group. So I think if we understood that if we were more consistent, we wouldn't swing from one extreme of invading and occupying countries, which clearly didn't work, to the other extreme of not being involved at all, which I think will be untenable. We'd have a more consistent and hopefully a more effective strategy. It seems strange that 20 years later, you have to make this very, I think, commonsensical argument, but what we're doing isn't working. And don't forget, one of the messages of my address was that our opponents have deliberately locked us in a war of attrition. They believe that they cannot defeat us militarily, but they can undermine our resolve. They can bankrupt us, as terrorists have done through history. Undermine confidence in elected leadership is always the terrorist's goal by creating crises. But we haven't learned that that's what the terrorist strategy, the timeless terrorist strategy is. And I think it's more important than ever that we change now and accept that the war on terrorism hasn't ended, but has to be prosecuted differently.
Thank you again. So I really would like to thank for your availability, your kindness, and your very interesting keynote speech. Your work has inspired other scholars' research, mine, for example, among others. And just to mention that the definition of terrorism that you provided and your books and articles are usually the most interesting and debated part of my course in Terrorism and Security International History. So thank you very much for joining us. It was really, I was really happy because of that. So thank you again.
Well, you're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
Hope to see you in person next time in Padua.
You're always welcome in Washington at Georgetown.
Thank you very much. Thank you again to Professor Hoffman. And we are going to see each other at 9:30 tomorrow morning with the next session dealing with 9/11. Thank you very much. I really appreciate also students' participation. So thank you again and see you tomorrow.
Thank you.